How long does fasting make your visceral fat release inflammatory signals before it finally starts to break down and shrink? This is a critical question, because visceral fat, the deep, hidden fat wrapped around your organs, is not just a passive storage site. It behaves like a secret inflammatory gland, constantly releasing chemical messengers that can silently damage your metabolism, your arteries, and even your brain. In this video, you are going to see what science suggests about how visceral fat behaves during fasting. When it is releasing more inflammatory hormones and cytokines, when it starts to let go of stored energy, and how this whole process can either hurt or help your health over time. Most people think fasting flips a simple switch. First you suffer, then suddenly your body burns fat and everything is positive. The reality is much more complex. Visceral fat is already inflamed before you start fasting, especially if you have been living with high insulin, excess calories, and chronic stress. When you begin to fast, hormones shift. Insulin falls, glucagon and adrenaline rise, and fat cells start to mobilize stored fat. In that transition, visceral fat can release a mix of fatty acids and inflammatory substances into the bloodstream, while at the same time, longer and repeated fasting windows can gradually reduce the overall load of this dangerous fat. In this video, you will discover why there is no single magic hour, but there is a clear direction. From an inflamed, overloaded fat depot toward a leaner, quieter, less toxic one, if fasting and lifestyle are used wisely. Before moving on, comment below if you are enjoying this video so far, and tell from which country or city you are watching. And stay with this video until the very end, because the final part will show how to think about fasting in a way that lowers visceral inflammation instead of making your body more stressed. Remember, if you are considering any fasting strategy to reduce visceral fat, always do it under the supervision of a licensed medical professional. To understand what happens during fasting, it is essential to understand what visceral fat really is. Visceral fat sits deep inside your abdomen, wrapped around organs such as your liver, pancreas, and intestines. Unlike the fat just under your skin, which is more visible and easier to pinch, visceral fat is mostly hidden. Someone can look only slightly overweight on the outside and still have a large amount of visceral fat on the inside. This hidden fat is strongly linked to insulin resistance, high blood pressure, fatty liver, and cardiovascular disease. Visceral fat behaves more like an endocrine organ than a simple energy warehouse. It secretes a variety of signaling molecules, often called adipokines, and cytokines, including tumor necrosis factor alpha, TNF-alpha, interleukin-6, IL-6, and others that promote low-grade chronic inflammation. These inflammatory signals travel through your bloodstream and affect blood vessels, the liver, muscles, and even the brain. At the same time, visceral fat tends to disrupt hormones such as leptin and adiponectin, which are involved in appetite control and insulin sensitivity. The result is a vicious cycle. More visceral fat leads to more inflammation and insulin resistance, which then encourages the body to store even more fat in this dangerous depot. This means that long before you start fasting, visceral fat is already leaking inflammatory hormones and substances every hour of the day. There is no need to wait for fasting to provoke that behavior. It is already happening in people with central obesity and metabolic syndrome. What fasting does is change the hormonal environment around those fat cells. As insulin drops and energy demands rise, the body begins to pull stored triglycerides out of visceral fat, releasing fatty acids and glycerol into the bloodstream. During this mobilization, inflammatory mediators can also be released from the shrinking fat depot. The key question is not only for how many hours does visceral fat release inflammatory hormones before breaking down, but how inflamed is that fat to begin with, and how can we shift it toward a less inflammatory state over weeks and months. Fasting is one of the tools that can help, especially when combined with better food choices, sleep, and stress management. Over time, as visceral fat volume decreases, the total inflammatory output of this tissue tends to decline as well. If you appreciate this kind of clear, science-based explanation of what is really happening inside your body, consider subscribing to the channel in a discreet way so you do not miss upcoming videos on visceral fat, hormones, fasting, and long-term metabolic health. When you start a fast, you do not instantly enter a clean, calm, fat-burning paradise. The first hours are a transition. After your last meal, your body remains in the fed state for several hours, with insulin still relatively elevated, and your cells using glucose from that meal as a main fuel. Visceral fat, already inflamed, continues to secrete cytokines and adipokines as it did before you started the fast. During this period, the effect of fasting has barely begun. You are still running on recent calories. As time passes, often between roughly 8 and 12 hours after your last meal, liver glycogen starts to fall and insulin gradually declines. The ratio between insulin and counter-regulatory hormones such as glucagon and adrenaline begins to shift. This is when the body starts sending stronger signals to adipose tissue, including visceral fat, to release stored fat. Triglycerides inside visceral fat cells are broken down into free fatty acids and glycerol, a process called lipolysis. These fatty acids are released into the bloodstream to be used as fuel by the liver, muscles, and other tissues. During this mobilization, inflammatory signaling does not immediately stop. In fact, in people with a lot of visceral fat and pre-existing metabolic stress, the early phase of fat mobilization can be a messy period where both fatty acids and inflammatory mediators are being released from an unhealthy fat depot. The bloodstream carries not only energy but also cytokines that can influence the liver, blood vessels, and immune cells. Subjectively, some people feel irritable, headachy, or more inflamed in the first phase of fasting, especially if they are used to constant high sugar intake or have unstable blood sugar. It is important to understand that science does not provide one exact number of hours where fasting makes visceral fat only release inflammation, and then, at a precise minute, switches into a clean breakdown mode. Instead, there is a continuum. In the first hours to perhaps the first day, especially in metabolically unhealthy individuals, the combination of fat mobilization and pre-existing inflammation can make the internal environment feel temporarily more turbulent. As fasting continues and becomes a repeated habit over weeks, the overall amount of visceral fat can shrink, and the total inflammatory output of that depot can decrease. So, if someone has a large amount of inflamed visceral fat and begins fasting, there may be an initial phase, measured more in days and repeated cycles than in a specific hour, where that tissue is still a strong source of inflammatory hormones even as it starts to break down. The longer-term objective is to reduce the volume of this toxic organ, so that both fat release and inflammatory signaling are lower overall. As fasting windows lengthen, or as intermittent fasting is repeated over time, the balance between inflammatory release and beneficial breakdown tends to move in a more positive direction, especially when accompanied by a healthy diet and lifestyle. After roughly 16 to 24 hours without food, many people experience more pronounced fat mobilization, higher ketone levels, and a more consistent low insulin environment. In this context, visceral fat continues to release fatty acids, but the body also becomes better at using them, and the overall metabolic stress pattern begins to change. Research on fasting and visceral fat shows that repeated periods of lower insulin and higher fat burning can reduce visceral fat stores over weeks and months. Clinical trials on time-restricted eating and alternate-day fasting often report decreases in waist circumference and improvements in markers of inflammation and insulin sensitivity, especially in people who started with obesity or metabolic syndrome. This suggests that, although visceral fat may release inflammatory substances as it is mobilized, the long-term trend with structured fasting is toward less total inflammatory output because there is physically less visceral fat present. In practical terms, the question, for how many hours does fasting make visceral fat release inflammatory hormones before breaking down? Misses a key point. Visceral fat is releasing inflammatory hormones all the time when it is abundant, and fasting accelerates both its mobilization and, over repeated cycles, its reduction. The early phase of any fasting habit, the first days and weeks, may feel more difficult because the body is adapting. But as visceral fat mass shrinks, metabolic flexibility improves, and inflammatory markers often decline. It is also important to recognize that not all individuals respond identically. People with different genetic backgrounds, levels of obesity, diets, and stress loads will experience different timelines. Some may see improvements in inflammatory markers and visceral fat measurements after a few weeks of structured fasting and healthy eating, while others may need longer. Age, sex, sleep, and physical activity all influence the speed of change. No study gives a single universal hour count for how long visceral fat releases inflammatory hormones before it becomes safe. Instead, studies look at changes over days, weeks, and months. In summary, longer or repeated fasting windows tend to shift visceral fat from being a constantly inflamed, expanding depot toward a shrinking, less active one. In the process, episodes of increased fat mobilization and temporary stress are balanced by long-term gains. Less visceral fat, better insulin sensitivity, and lower chronic inflammation, especially when fasting is intelligently integrated into a comprehensive lifestyle plan rather than used as an isolated extreme. Because visceral fat is already inflamed, the goal is not simply to fast as long as possible, but to apply fasting in a way that gradually reduces that toxic fat without overwhelming the body. The first pillar is safety. People with type 1 diabetes, advanced type 2 diabetes on insulin, or multiple glucose-lowering medications, significant heart, kidney, or liver disease, a history of eating disorders, pregnancy, breastfeeding, adolescence, or very low body weight must be extremely cautious, and should not attempt extended fasting without close medical supervision, if at all. In these cases, the risks from blood sugar swings, electrolyte disturbances, or cardiovascular strain can be serious. For those who are medically cleared, the best strategy is usually to start with modest, consistent fasting windows, for example, 12 to 14 hours overnight, and combine them with a nutrient-dense diet. This gives the body time to adapt to lower insulin periods while still getting sufficient nutrition and micronutrients. Over time, if tolerated and approved by a health professional, some individuals may extend the fasting window to 16 hours or use other structured patterns such as 5.2 or occasional longer fasts. The emphasis should be on regularity and sustainability, not on pushing the longest possible fast every time. Diet quality is crucial for calming visceral inflammation. Outside the fasting window, focusing on whole foods, high-quality protein, healthy fats, and fiber-rich vegetables helps reduce the triggers that originally pushed visceral fat to become inflamed. Constant sugar spikes, refined carbohydrates, and ultra-processed foods. Anti-inflammatory dietary patterns, such as those rich in omega-3 fats, colorful vegetables, and minimal trans fats, can further support the transition from an inflamed to a calmer, visceral fat depot. As visceral fat shrinks, the total amount of inflammatory hormones and cytokines it releases generally declines. Lifestyle factors beyond food and fasting also matter. Chronic stress, poor sleep, and a sedentary lifestyle all promote visceral fat accumulation and inflammation. Managing stress through techniques like breathing exercises, meditation, or gentle movement, improving sleep quality, and incorporating regular physical activity, especially resistance training and walking, can amplify the positive effects of fasting on visceral fat. Muscles that are more insulin-sensitive help siphon glucose out of the bloodstream, reducing the need for high insulin levels and making it easier for the body to access fat stores in a controlled way. Ultimately, fasting does not impose a fixed number of inflammatory hours on visceral fat before it allows that fat to break down. Visceral fat is inflamed because of past choices and metabolic context. Fasting is one of the tools that can, over time, shrink that depot and reduce its inflammatory power. Used wisely, under medical supervision and inside a healthy lifestyle, fasting can turn visceral fat from a constant internal threat into a gradually diminishing problem. Used recklessly, it can add more stress to an already overloaded system.